My name is Samar Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East and North African Studies. And I'm basically just a glorified timekeeper. And I will also read to you sort of a bio of Rabbi Brant from this laptop, which I'm carrying like a pizza. And just as a reminder, the usual tradition of the colloquium is that we leave the last half hour from 1:30 to 2, where it's just interaction between students who are registered and the guest. So we'll ask members of the general public to give us the room at 1:30. So today's talk is by Rabbi Brant Rosen from Chicago. The talk is called "The Many Faces of Palestinian Nonviolent Resistance." Rabbi Brant Rosen is the Midwest Regional Director of the American Friends Service Committee and rabbi of a newly formed congregation, Tzedek Chicago. He is the co-founder of Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council and the author of Wrestling in the Daylight, a rabbi's path to Palestinian Solidarity. He writes regularly about the subject of Israel-Palestine on his blog, Shalom Rav, which you can find online at rabbibrant.com, and has participated in numerous solidarity delegations to the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and he has arrived fresh, actually, from Gaza. We're very, very honored to have Rabbi Brant here. Thank you very much for joining me and welcoming us.
Thank you, Summer, and thank you, all of you, for coming. I'm honored. I was looking at the slate of speakers that you've had up until now and that we'll have during the course of the year, and I'm very, very honored to be part of this ongoing conversation that you're having. It's remarkable and impressive, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. And I really do want this to be conversation as much as possible, so I'll say a few words at the beginning, and I want to say at the outset that I'm going to divert a little bit from the topic, in as much as I'm not a scholar of Palestinian popular resistance. I'm not Palestinian, and I think there are many resources you can go to learn about this history and to learn about the current state of the movement. I'll talk about it, but really from my own subjective point of view, which I'll contextualize for you in a little bit. But I feel increasingly when I go out and talk, especially about the issue of Israel-Palestine, that when speaking about the subject of Palestinians, I'm becoming increasingly aware that I'm a white Jewish guy from Chicago, and it's important that Palestinians be centered in the conversation about Palestinians, and so I want to put that caveat out there, that I'm really speaking really for myself and my own experiences. The other caveat I want to offer is that particularly on the subject of nonviolent resistance and Palestinian nonviolent resistance, I'm becoming increasingly uneasy at sometimes the way that in those in positions of power often insist that those who are under their power be nonviolent. And I wanted to offer you a few anecdotes of what I mean by that and why I think it's applicable to the situation today. Nelson Mandela, who you've all heard of, I know, and is held up today as a nonviolent icon, not that long ago was considered a terrorist by this country and was vilified. I'm old enough to remember that very, very well, before he became a symbol, when he was still a real human being. And he was in jail for a very, very long time, and I think few people know that he was offered the opportunity 6 separate times to be let out of prison if he would publicly renounce violence on behalf of the ANC. And each time he refused. And each time he said, let the government renounce nonviolence. And I think that's really, an important point, that state violence is something that we often just assume and we give the right to the state to wield it, and we don't even think twice about it. It would be unthinkable to insist, I think, when we're talking about the Israel-Palestine collision in the mainstream media to talk about Israel's violence toward Palestinians. Just the way it's really unthinkable that we talk about our country's violence toward many majority Muslim nations that we are continually at war with. We are in a constant state of violence, and yet we tend to almost fetishize those who resist violence nonviolently as somehow saintly, as somehow this is the way they should be behaving. So there's another example of this, actually, and this one you might be more familiar with, a very famous speech given by Martin Luther King called "The Time to Break Silence." It was 1967. It was one of the last major speeches he gave, and it was a very controversial speech because he was breaking silence on the issue of Vietnam, and it got him a lot of negative attention, even from within the civil rights movement. And he made one point about the issue of violence when he was addressing the riots that had been going on in ghettos across the country at the time. And I'm quoting, it's a fairly famous quote: "As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. But they asked, what about Vietnam? They asked if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government." I think his words, for me, I would say that his words are even more relevant today. I think we are the purveyor of even more violence in the world than in 1967. That was one specific war he was addressing. We are, as I said before, in a state of eternal war at this point. And so I guess I'm talking about nonviolent resistance within the context of saying I believe, as international law would have it, that people who are oppressed, people who are under occupation, people who are under colonial domination have a right to resist. If they are being attacked through armed oppression, they have a right to resist through armed resistance. So I think we need to think about the principle of self-defense when we think about nonviolent resistance. I think many of the Palestinians who I'll be talking about talk about nonviolent resistance as a strategy, something that they employ because violence has simply not been effective and has brought misery down on the Palestinian people by and large. But it's certainly the prerogative of people who are being physically attacked to resist physically. And that's a very important caveat that I want to offer here, and I hope will be part of the context of your conversation on this subject writ large during the course of your colloquium. I guess for me, one of the important things about addressing this issue is that I believe that Muslims and Palestinians in particular are often seen as incorrigibly violent. And it's important to let people and educate people about the very extensive history and current reality of nonviolent resistance in the Muslim world and in the Palestinian world. I have a feeling that I might be speaking to the choir in this room on that subject, but I think for that reason alone, it's important to raise this issue, along with the caveats that I presented to you. I'll stop there. Is there anything I said not clear, or does anyone have thoughts or responses to my introduction before I go on? Okay. So I'll speak, as I said, to my own experience. I'm probably one of the least likely people you would meet who would be involved in standing in solidarity with Palestinian popular resistance. I've for most of my adult life, been a congregational rabbi in Evanston, Illinois. For most of my adult life, I've been a Zionist and identified deeply with the state of Israel vis-a-vis my own Jewish identity. And I've really been on something of a journey on this issue, and my understanding of the situation in Israel-Palestine has really evolved over time, as you might imagine. I would say that the paradigm that I understand, I refer to it as the Israel-Palestine collision. I don't know really a good word for it. I resist using the word conflict anymore because a conflict paradigm presumes something of a level playing field. We have two people who are in conflict over the same piece of land, and if we can find a way to bring them to the table to compromise, then the conflict will be resolved. And that was the paradigm I think I and many, particularly liberal Zionists, understood the situation for a very, very long time. And I will say that that's not the paradigm I understand. I probably, in my heart of hearts, maybe didn't really believe it, but the narrative, the Zionist narrative in particular, the notion that we have this oppressed people, the Jewish people, who have been in exile for thousands of years and persecuted for thousands of years, and then following the Holocaust finally were given their independence. You know, the line from the Israeli national anthem, Lihiot Am Chofshi Be'artzenu, to be a free people in our own land. That is a very powerful and redemptive narrative, and it was very much a central narrative of my own Jewish identity, as it has been for my generation and my parents' generation. I think that narrative is starting to crumble with the current generation of young Jews, but I'll get to that in a moment. And so I've come to realize that the paradigm and the analysis of the situation for me is not so much of a conflict paradigm, but more of a colonial paradigm, or, for lack of a better term, an oppression paradigm. That we have one immensely more powerful party in the state of Israel that is occupying a much weaker people, people who lived on this land for many generations, people who have been turned into refugees, people who are not allowed to return to their homes, people who are living under military occupation, people in Gaza who are living under a total blockade from air, land, and sea and living in what is essentially an open-air prison, people in the state of Israel who are living as second-class citizens because they're not Jewish, and to be living in a Jewish state and not be Jewish means you're automatically somehow otherized. That's not really a conflict for me. I think in as much as in this country, I wouldn't say that the situation between our government and the native peoples of this country, the nations that lived in this country before the colonists arrived, I wouldn't call that a conflict either. I'd call it something much more intrinsically connected to colonization and the oppression that goes with it. So I moved from a liberal Zionist point of view and approach to the issue, because I've been an activist on this issue for a very long time, to being a Palestinian Solidarity activist. And I continued to do that in my congregation. And you would think that any nice liberal congregation would toss their rabbi out once he started saying such things, but to their credit, they didn't. I stayed there for 6 years after I really started to become active in this movement and becoming active in Jewish Voice for Peace, as Samer mentioned. And I ended up leaving because it just created too much tension within my congregation. But within those 6 years, I was able to really bring people along in ways that I never dreamed I could have. I led a delegation of congregants to the West Bank, where we stayed in refugee camps, where we met with Palestinians, where we saw the nonviolent resistance movement and the popular resistance movement in action. We went to one of the Friday demonstrations that I'll talk to you about in a moment that occur every Friday afternoon. And I was under the feeling that I was going with the assumption that if people saw it with their own eyes the way I had, they would understand what I've been ranting and raving about in my congregation. And when you see occupation up close, you can't help but understand that it's something that is intrinsically violent. So this is something else when we talk about the issue of nonviolence, that when you live in an militarily occupied community, you are living every second of your life within a context of violence. That means that the people who have power over you are soldiers with machine guns who can come into your home at any time and take you out of your bed and put you in a truck and take you to a military prison, who can shoot at you if they believe that you're demonstrating inappropriately, who staff these checkpoints in which, in order just to go several kilometers, can take many, many hours to go from one place to the next. And when you live, just for me, just living relatively temporarily under that, I found it utterly intolerable. And the Palestinians who I met live with that every day. And it became clear to me that, as some friends of mine put it, that their very existence is resistance. Every time that they wake up every morning and get their kids off to school and are able to manage to live a dignified life under such, needless to say, undignified circumstances, that is a form of resistance. So nonviolent resistance is not only direct action and demonstrations and strategies of how to leverage people power to shift political power, although it is that too. But it's also just the simple everyday life of people who are living in these circumstances. And of course, it goes without saying, not only in Palestine. And I would say that the people who I brought to Palestine to see this up close, they got it. They by and large understood. I'm not sure that they know what to do with it. It's enormously troubling. It should get to us. But I think it's very important for us, particularly when I say us, I mean white privileged folk in this country, to leave our comfortable bubbles and forge real relationships with people who live in these communities and in these circumstances, and allow them to help us understand. It's not their responsibility to make us understand, but there are many who want their stories told and to bear witness to what is going on. And I've seen that really as my job going forward, is to tell these stories and to bear witness to some of the things that I've seen. I eventually left my congregation, and as Samar mentioned, I'm working now for the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker social justice organization that just this year celebrated its 100th year. It's a very large, international, venerable peace organization that's been doing really important work for a long time, and that I have many friends who have worked for AFSC in the past. I've marched and strategized with AFSC staff people all over the country for many years, and it was in many ways a natural fit for me. And in many ways, although it's a Quaker-based, faith-based organization, I'm of the opinion that I think what's important in religion is not the denomination, but the values that they espouse. And those are the most important differences. I think the most important differences are things like, do you believe in standing with the oppressed or don't you? Do you believe in calling out the oppressor or don't you? And those threads, both of those threads, both using religion as a force for oppression and using religion as a force for resisting oppression, I think are present in all religions. So I have no trouble saying that at AFSC, in a Quaker world, I feel very, very much at home in some circumstances, even more than many of the Jewish contexts that I often find myself in, which often have sort of a knee-jerk adherence to seeing Zionism and Jewish statehood as a necessary prerequisite for being Jewish in this country. So I've been working for AFSC for 3 years now, and I just want to give you a little bit of a understanding of the organization and lead that into the trip that I just took to the West Bank and Gaza for work. So AFSC, as I mentioned, is 100 years old, and it started in the wake of World War I, as it did work with returning veterans and helping provide relief and service to returning veterans, and also throughout Europe doing reconciliation work with citizens who are on both sides of the war. And since that time, AFSC has been sort of this ubiquitous presence in these conflict zones, in these conflict areas. One of the things that I learned that I didn't know is that during the beginning of World War II for the United States, AFSC was the only organization in the country that opposed the internment of Japanese Americans in camps, which I was kind of surprised to learn. Even the ACLU didn't oppose it. And I learned about this because I was called one day, I was brand new on the job, by a Japanese organization in Chicago, and they wanted me to come speak on a panel on Pearl Harbor Day about the internment. And since I worked for AFSC, I could talk about AFSC's work. And I said, I would be honored to. And then I went and immediately Googled AFSC Japanese internment. And I was just overwhelmed by what I read. And they actually went into the camps and got young people out of the camps. They would find them scholarships in college. So they weren't only protesting, but they were actively working to remove people from those circumstances. And it was very moving to talk about that. And there were survivors of the internment camps there, and came up to me and hugged me afterwards. And all I could say was, "You're welcome." It was a very humbling moment. The other thing that I have known about AFSC is that in 1949, after the refugee crisis was caused through the war between the nascent state of Israel and Palestine, over 700,000 refugees were driven from their homes or became refugees. People became refugees and not allowed to return. And many of these refugees ended up in Gaza. Gaza is as those of you who attended Ashley's talk, I've heard about this, that Gaza was never such a densely populated area, and it never had so many refugees until 1949. The majority of the people who live in Gaza have their roots in Palestine, in the middle and upper Galilee region of Palestine. I think today that number is somewhere around 60–65%. Ironically, well, I'll move on to that when I get to my visit, but at the time, the UN asked AFSC to go in to Gaza to provide relief for the refugees, and which AFSC did. They were there even before the UN was there. And then time went on, and there was the assumption that there would be some kind of repatriation or return in some fashion. That didn't happen. And then eventually AFSC said to the United Nations, we're not going to just do this indefinitely if there's not going to be some kind of political solution to this. We're not here just to enable. And so that's when the UN created UNRWA, which is the organization that is still serving the refugees in Gaza and the West Bank and other Palestinian refugee camps in the Middle East. Palestinian refugees are the largest and oldest refugee population in the world, going on almost 70 years. So I'm proud to be associated with an organization like this as a Jew. I think as a Jew, this is a nation that is purporting to speak for me as a Jewish state, and I believe that according to the values of my tradition, it's one of the most sacrosanct things I can do is to stand with the oppressed, even when the oppressed are being, or maybe especially when the oppressed are being oppressed by my own people. So I want to say just a little bit about my recent trip and then some other work that I've done, and then I'll open it up to conversation. And I'm really happy to talk about anything I've talked about or anything I haven't talked about, in as much as I have answers. So my most recent trip took me to Ramallah, which is a large city in the West Bank, in the middle of the West Bank, where we have staff, and to Gaza, where we have staff. The AFSC has been a presence in Gaza since '49, but not doing relief work, doing civil engagement work, and more recently doing, for lack of a better term, what I would call co-resistance work. So I went there for staff meetings, basically, to meet with staff to strategize about the programs that we run there. And basically the programs that we run for Palestinians in Palestine with Palestinian staff have to address the issue of fragmentation of Palestinian society, which is a huge, huge issue for Palestinians, that it's an enormously and deeply fragmented community. There are Palestinians in the diaspora, there are Palestinians in refugee camps, there are Palestinian citizens of Israel, there are Palestinians under military occupation in the West Bank, and then there are Palestinians under blockade in Gaza, and they all are, by and large, separated from one another, and they live under radically different circumstances as well. So you can imagine it's difficult for them to create a sense of cohesiveness, let alone a cohesive resistance movement when they are so divided. And I would argue that it's a time-honored colonial tradition to separate, to divide and conquer. I think this is not by accident, I think it's by design, and I would say by and large it's working. So the programs that AFSC is running in Palestine are trying to address with youth a way to connect Palestinians from various strata of Palestinian society with one another. And we've been doing that through meetings. More often than not, the Gazan youth are Skyped into the meetings that are held in the West Bank. But occasionally we've gotten permits for them to leave Gaza and to go into the West Bank and actually meet for the first time their peers, which even though it's just a few miles away, it might as well be on another planet. I was speaking with one of the youth in Gaza who is old enough now to just barely remember what life was like before the blockade, but not really. And she said to me, before I went through the Erez crossing into Israel, all I knew of Jews and all I knew of Israelis were just as bombers, as helicopters, as drones. I'd never really seen an Israeli before. And so the first time, she described the first time she actually saw a soldier on the other side, and how unnerving and how traumatic it was for her. At the same time, talking with Palestinian youth in the West Bank, soldiers are part of their everyday experience. They encounter soldiers in everyday life in all kinds of circumstances because they live under military occupation. The military is the law where they live. So that's just one example of how, even though they share the same land and they have the same history and culture, their experience is radically different from one another. So when I say co-resistance, this is not simply a program that is doing leadership training and helping engage them in their communities. I think by and large we're coming to realize that that might be something to do when you live in a relatively normal circumstance, but when you live in such a radically abnormal circumstance, you don't really have a community to speak of. And the problem is not so much how to help people progress in a world where there is absolutely no chance of progress, and more how can we create bonds between Palestinian peers in other parts of the land, so that they can build community and resist the occupation that is so oppressive in their lives. I want to say, I've alluded to this, and this is what I'll end with for now. I alluded before to the fact that there's a new generation of American Jews, North American Jews, who I believe are not buying into the narrative, the traditional narrative that I referred to before, the Zionist narrative. And I think that's due to for a lot of different reasons, and we can talk about that. But the bottom line is, in my own experience as a congregational rabbi, just seeing kids growing up in my congregation, I've now done, weddings for people who I remember when they were little toddlers, so I'm very old. And I've seen their development, particularly around this issue, and I've seen their struggle around the issue of Israel. And I will say that no kid loves going to Sunday school, no matter what your denomination. That's something we all have in common. But I would say that the most challenging thing to teach kids in religious school traditionally has been the issue of Israel, because it's been very difficult to explain to them why Israel should be important to them. You know, it's a faraway country that's has no connection to their real life. If they don't have family there, if they don't have any other connection that they bring to the table, then it's, what are we teaching them really? I think synagogues, many synagogues, most liberal synagogues want to teach connection, want to instill connection to Israel among the young people, but it's very, very challenging. And the older they get, and the more politically savvy they get, I think the more they're able to see the writing on the wall. I think Israel's behavior in the public sphere is just much more open to the light of day than it ever has been. I think, you know, in the age of the internet and 24-hour news cycles, the image of Israel is just very, very different than even the one that I grew up with. So I think that's why, by the way, the government of Israel and Jewish communal philanthropists are literally spending hundreds of millions of dollars for free trips to Israel for young people, known as Birthright mostly. They are putting a great deal of emphasis on college campuses, including this one, to raise awareness about their view of Israel and to fight against Palestinian Solidarity activity that's going on campus. And I think it's an uphill battle, personally. I think they wouldn't be spending so much money on this if it wasn't. But I think the tide is moving away. I think young people, young Jews are not buying the narrative quite the same way. And if I ever had any doubt, these last 2 summers for me were a very sobering and powerful lesson in that regard. So there's a relatively new initiative called the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which was founded about maybe 3 to 4 years ago by an American Jewish woman who had lived in Israel for many, many years and had collaborated with many Palestinian civil society groups in the West Bank in bringing American Jews to meet with them and dialogue with them. And her name is Ilana Sumka. Eventually, she came to realize that it's not enough simply to engage in dialogue if we're going to really try to address the inherent issue of injustice that's on the ground. We need to not just learn from Palestinians, but stand with them. And this is where the nonviolent resistance comes in. Through her relationship with them and other Israeli Palestinian Solidarity activists, in other words, Israelis who stand in solidarity with Palestinians, we have managed to create a connection between diaspora Jews, largely in the United States or North America, but some from Europe as well, and go over to Palestine to participate in some of these nonviolent actions. And to take our cue from the activists on the ground who have been doing this work. So I participated in the delegation last summer, not this last summer, but 2 summers ago, when there were about 40 to 50 of us, mostly young people. I was one of the old men in the group. And this summer there were about 150, and again, also largely young people. Many of them were from Jewish Voice for Peace and a group that some of you may have heard of called If Not Now, which is largely young people who are organizing around the country to hold the Jewish establishment community accountable on the issue of the occupation. And together we went and participated together with these Palestinian groups that are standing up against the occupation nonviolently on a regular basis. And that goes on in many, many different fronts. And I can talk more about that. I can talk about the current state of affairs in the Palestinian popular resistance if people are interested. But it happens in many, I think the description of my talk was the many manifestations. It happens in many ways. There are villages in the West Bank that since the wall went up, since the barrier wall went up, have been cutting off many of these villages from their sources of livelihood, cutting through their fields, giving them non-access to their farming. there's a network of villages who are coming together every Friday afternoon to go to the wall to demonstrate, and are met with viciously violent response from the American weapons, American supplied weapons and the Israeli military every single week. This goes on. That's one level of the resistance. Another level is Ashley talked about in Gaza, the buffer zone protests that have been going on there, and in many ways are even more dangerous. By and large, in the West Bank, the military response is tear gas and rubber-coated steel bullets that can kill and have killed. But in Gaza, they use live ammunition directly at Palestinians who venture into the what's called the buffer zone between Gaza and Israel. There's remote-controlled machine guns on the wall that automatically just shoot at whatever movement there is in the buffer zone. So it takes immense courage just to go out and collect gravel or scrap metal to help fix your home in Gaza. In Hebron, in the city in the West Bank, which is there is radical and severe separation between the Jewish settlers who live in the center of the city and the tens of thousands of Palestinians who live throughout it. There is a group called Youth Against the Settlements, led by a man named Issa Amro, who was recently in the United States, talking about his experiences. We collaborated with Youth Against the Settlements when we were there as well. They do direct actions on a regular basis as well. There are lots of different examples of this going on. The one probably most prominent in terms of solidarity in this country is BDS, which I know you're going to hear about from another speaker a little bit later. But boycott, divestment, and sanctions is at heart a nonviolent campaign. It has become so thoroughly twisted around, I think, and mischaracterized by the government of Israel, by our own government in this country, and Israel advocates in general. But it's important to know, and you'll learn more about this. I highly suggest you come to the session on BDS. It began as a call from Palestinian civil society in 2005 because the peace process was completely defunct and Israel was only increasing their settlement of the West Bank. Armed resistance hadn't worked. The Palestinian civil society, and it was over 150, maybe 180 organizations, on-the-ground organizations, called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions with three basic goals. The first is equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel. The second is an end to the occupation, the West Bank and Gaza. And the third is honoring the right of return of Palestinian refugees to their homes. So it inherently deals with the three basic groups of Palestinians that I referred to before: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians under occupation, and refugees. And the call for BDS is a call for boycott. We all know what boycott is. Boycotting consumer goods, boycotting cultural institutions. Divestment means divesting your funds from companies that profit from the occupation. And sanctions is something that governments do to other governments, which we are perhaps far from at this point, but I don't know, maybe not. I'm old enough to remember in South Africa when the notion of sanctioning South Africa was enormously controversial. And the Congress under the Reagan administration came up with an anti-apartheid bill, and he vetoed it, and they overrode the veto, which was this enormous moment in the movement that a country that was not that long before seen as a staunch ally was now had, I think, largely due, not only but largely due to the divestment movement and the nonviolent international solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement, had moved and isolated the regime to the point that it became untenable for it to continue to oppress Black South Africans. So that's essentially the core of BDS, and it is at its heart a nonviolent call. And it's being characterized as delegitimizing and nonviolent, but I think it's important for us to see it in context. Boycott is a time-honored method of resistance, whether it was the Montgomery bus boycott, whether it was the United Farm Workers boycott. These are movements that we venerate. Again, nonviolent movements that we venerate today. This is in that tradition. It's an oppressed people who are calling for international solidarity and to participate in their struggle through nonviolent means, through consumer boycotts and divestment of funds, et cetera. Often in the Jewish community, you'll hear people say things like, well, this is just like Nazi Germany, right? And the Nazis boycotted Jewish communities back before and during World War II. And it doesn't take a long time to sort of unpack the fallacy of that comparison if you really think about it. Those are examples of nations using boycotts, governments using boycotts to oppress a minority in their country. The BDS call, just like the other boycotts that I referred to, are calls from a persecuted people who are calling for international solidarity with their cause, which is a radically different thing. So there's a great deal of misinformation that's being bandied about vis-a-vis BDS. And I think if we have any self-respecting conversation about the Palestinian Nonviolent Resistance Movement, I think BDS needs to be mentioned as well. So I'll end with this by saying that when I mentioned the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, I bring that up not just to talk about my own experiences, but to say that I believe that there is a nascent Jewish participation in this movement. It's largely led by young people, but not only. I've started a new congregation in Chicago that is founded on these principles that I've been talking about just now, and it's really very multi-generational. I think in many ways there has been a few generations now of American Jews who have been deeply disturbed by the conflation of Zionism with Judaism itself and are beginning to find the courage of their convictions. And you know, the fact that I can continue to do this work within a Jewish context and find colleagues in the greater interfaith world that are standing with us to build this movement, I find enormously heartening. At the same time, I will say that the challenge is immense. And if you go to the West Bank and see the day-to-day life there and the desperation of that day-to-day life, people can only be oppressed for so long. You know, I talked before about existence is resistance, and it's true. There's a concept in Arabic called sumud, which means steadfastness, and the Palestinians are nothing if not steadfast. But I think sometimes it's easy to idealize that and to focus so much on the steadfastness that we're not focusing on what this kind of cruelty does to people and the incredible trauma that people are living under every day. And so it is a huge uphill battle. I'm not sanguine about the prospects for it coming to a just solution, maybe even not in my lifetime. I'm not sure. I have colleagues who would disagree with me on that. But I think the struggle is a just one, an important one, and the fact that it's acquiring new members every day, even from unexpected places like the Jewish community, I think it can only be a good sign. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm very eager to have conversation with you all. So thank you all for coming. Samar, should I just call people, or you call people? Okay, so just raise your hand. Yes.
It seemed that I heard you use the analogy of Gaza as an open-air prison. I think in some ways that's far too kind, because no other prison population has got to get its own food and provide its own medical services. I think it's more akin to, what, fish in a barrel, or a devastated urban game preserve. I mean, it's really a use of words or a misuse of words that paints this somehow slightly better or okay view of what Palestinians really are going through.
Point taken.
Yeah. And I'm grateful that you've been so open about your own journey from, ardent Zionist to not. And yesterday I had the privilege of listening to Alice Rothschild, and she makes the distinction that she thinks that really the root of the problem is Zionism or Jewish privilege, and that within the Jewish community, well, particularly the younger, that is changing.
Yeah, as
you said.
I mentioned that I was a liberal Zionist for most of my adult life, and the liberal Zionist approach sees really the problem starting in 1967, and with the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and if only that can be dealt with, in some equitable way, will solve the situation. But it doesn't reckon with sort of the original sin, which happened in 1948, and that's with the displacing or ethnic cleansing, whatever you want to say, of the people who lived there in order to make way for a majority Jewish state. And when you say that the problem is Zionism, I think that it's very difficult to say because Zionism has become so central to the American Jewish identity, maybe, and Jews throughout the world. But when you think about it, Zionism is a very recent phenomenon, right? It's only a few hundred years old. It started in the 19th century. It's a form of nationalism, modern nationalism. It sought to subvert centuries of Jewish experience in the diaspora, which it saw as a horrible place for Jews. And so it's a new and relatively radical movement in the Jewish world. And for it to become so quickly conflated with Judaism itself, I think is problematic. I find problematic. But it's very difficult for people to go there to see that 48 is the problem and not 67, and that the problem is the very concept of a Jewish state that, as you put it, privileges one group of people over another. But on the other hand, it's really quite simple. I mean, how could you not see that? That if you predicate a state on keeping a demographic majority of one people in a place that has been historically diverse and multi-ethnic and multi-religious, aren't you sowing the seeds for unpleasantness just by the very concept? So, yeah, I think more people are willing to say these kinds of things out loud in the Jewish community, that we need to unpack Zionism and not just the occupation, so-called. Yes?
You just called it the original sin in 1948 when Israel, the War of Independence. I would argue that the original sin, another original sin could be interpreted as the destruction of the first and second temple and the creation of the Jewish people as a people of refugees. My question is, if you identify with BDS and the return of Palestinian refugees, what about identifying with the unjust action that was done 2,000 years ago, number one, and also the renaming of the land as Palestine by Romans to blot out any identification of the Jewish people with the land of Israel?
I would say that, well, first of all, Jews didn't become refugees as a result of the Second Temple. They were dispersed throughout the diaspora and lived as residents of the nations, in which they made communities, in some cases very rich and important communities throughout the diaspora. I would say that treating the destruction of the first and second temple as on the same par with events that occurred in 1948 is problematic. I think there's much that we don't know about the history of that period, and to blame it all on the Romans, I think is a bit naive. I think we don't know if there was, archaeologists tell us we don't really know if there was a land of Israel the way it was described in the Bible. The Bible is not a history book. The Bible is a religious text. And there are Israeli archaeologists, people like Israel Finkelstein, for instance, who say that there's very little archaeological evidence for many of the things that the Bible says about, particularly the first temple. So, I think when we talk about the current geopolitical reality, winding the clock back thousands of years, I mean, we could, if we're going to talk about original sin, why don't we talk about what we read in the Bible about the Israelites going into Canaan and wiping out the people of Canaan? We can play that game, ad infinitum. But the reality is that we know we have, in our time, in our day, there was this injustice that occurred at a certain time and is reverberating until now, and that there is suffering that is occurring even now as a result of that. And unless that injustice of our time is dealt with, there's never going to be real peace in that land. Yes.
So you talked about the fragmentation of the Palestinian people, and I think that's an important context to understand this. Could you comment a little bit about this perhaps rapprochement between Fatah and Hamas, and whether that's something that perhaps could be a positive sign here?
So we were in Gaza right after, like literally the day after the first round of talks in Gaza, and we were told that when the PA delegation came in and met, they were greeted by the Hamas officials. There were just like scores of people on the streets cheering. And I think those in my fellow staff members who had been to Gaza before were a little bit reserved about the prospect. But when we went in and we met with Gazans, the staff people there and other Gazans, they actually expressed some guarded optimism, which is very, very rare in Gaza, and not optimism that for them. They may think about things geopolitically, but their main concerns are about things like electricity and drinkable water and freedom of movement. That's really what they're looking for. And I think so the guarded optimism was not any illusion that the blockade would be lifted, soon, because that's really up to Israel, not Egypt. Egypt has been brokering the reconciliation talks. But there was hope that there'd be more electricity. They only get 4 hours of electricity a day. That there would be drinkable water. All of the 98% of the water is undrinkable because it's sewage. The sewage treatment plants have no electricity, and it's pouring into the ocean and into the water sources in Gaza. And that there might be some relaxation of freedom of movement through the Rafah crossing in the southern border. But there's a lot that needs to be overcome in order for that to happen. The U.S. and Israel have made it clear that it's not going to recognize anything that has to do with Hamas. So I would say that there's some guarded hope, but also a real sense of realism. And then it's always followed by, and Israel could come in tomorrow and just start bombing. That's always a constant in Gaza. That whatever progress is made, there's always that sense it could all be wiped out in a second because they've experienced that repeatedly. Yes?
I was wondering if it's not too personal, if you could kind of tell us about the transformation of your own thought, if there's anything that we can take from your experience about changing other people's minds.
Yeah, I mean, my goal is not to change people's minds. My goal is just to speak my truth as I see it and participate in this movement that I think is important. And if there are people for whom it resonates with, I'm grateful. But I'll say that I think I mentioned before, Israel has always been very important to me. It continues to be important to me. I have family in Israel on my father's side, and we've visited ever since me and my brothers and my family visited since we were children. I lived in Israel for a few years when I took time off from college and went there to live, and considered moving to a kibbutz. I lived on a kibbutz for much of that time, and was very attracted particularly by the values of labor Zionism and progressive Zionism. I would say I was always on the left edge of the spectrum, but still believed the importance of a Jewish state, but also believed that there needed to be alongside a viable Palestinian state. I was always an advocate for the two-state solution up until recently. Back in the day when that was considered a very edgy thing. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine now, and the two-state solution has become, sort of the standard talking point for the Western world. But it wasn't that long ago that even the suggestion of speaking to Arafat and the PLO was just considered beyond the pale. So, for me, I think I might have said this. I always, in my gut, felt there was something not quite right, and I never stopped long enough to really unpack it. So things like the fact that there were all these Palestinians who I didn't really have a relationship with, and they were everywhere, and this was a Jewish state, but there were so many people who weren't Jewish, and I was just sort of traveling in this, hermetically sealed Jewish world. And every once in a while I'd think, there's something really kind of troubling about that, and that always kind of, usually the way I would quiet those thoughts is by saying, well, it's complicated. It's very complicated. That's a good liberal saying. And it's a great way to avoid hard truths, I think. And things like that. In the early 80s, I mentioned the Israeli historians who wrote about the circumstances of the creation of the State of Israel in 48 and 49, and the fact that the narrative that this was a war of independence, and it was a war between two armies, or this nascent Jewish army that was eventually victorious, was actually not quite that. That there were very conscious attempts at ethnically cleansing or removing Palestinians from villages and razing those villages and not allowing them to return to make way for a Jewish majority. That stuff really affected me, and it was interesting. In Israel, I think it caused a real reckoning, and there was a lot written about those. They're called the new historians, people like Benny Morris and Ilan Pape and Avi Shleim and Tom Segev. You can read all their stuff in English. And it's interesting, but I think the liberal response, other than it's complicated, was, this is the way nations are created. What are you going to do, right? This is how this country was created. We almost exterminated an entire indigenous people, and if you're going to have a nation state, that sort of goes with the territory. And that never worked well for me. It also, I think, raised my awareness and my consciousness about colonialism in this country in ways that I think all of us so easily consider to be complicated. I think it's ultimately, every situation is different. I mean, settler colonial societies are different in the way they go about creating these colonies, but the bottom line is it's all really the same basic thing. And I think for me, eventually, what tipped the scale were I said before, just how patently oppressive things were, that it was very hard to deny it, and it was hard to rationalize it. As a congregational rabbi, you're supposed to sort of make sense of it all for your congregation, and I couldn't really make sense of it for myself, other than say this is just wrong. And for me, the big turning point was the end of 2008 and beginning of 2009. It was called Operation Cast Lead by Israel. It was one of the military onslaughts, now 3 military onslaughts ago, that just had such brutal casualties. And I just, at that point, said, I can't do this anymore. I can't apologize for this anymore. Yeah.
What is your vision of an ultimate goal for the land of Palestine?
The question was, what is my vision for the ultimate goal for the land? It's not up to me. I think part of the problem is that through the peace process, we've been so focused on the end game, the ultimate vision, that we're not really dealing with the reality on the ground right now, which is intolerable. And we're thinking that just by rewriting a map, we're going to somehow solve what I called before the essential injustice of what occurred. And so, all I can say is my vision is a land or lands, that in which everybody who lives there has equal rights, full citizenship, and all the rights that come with them. What that looks like, again, as I said, it's not up to me. I think the people who live there are going to have to negotiate that. But it's just very simple. I think we need a place where everybody lives under civil law, under the same authority, or if it's two states, then two separate authorities. But I personally, I'm hard pressed to see how two states can be created out of the reality that's there now. But again, it's not up to me. I tend to approach this from a human rights perspective or a rights perspective, rather than saying who has the right to this piece of land or that piece of land. I'd rather focus on the individual rights of everybody who lives in that territory, and use that as your jumping off point to determine what the end game is going to look like. And that's exactly what we're not doing right now, unfortunately. At least the politicians aren't.
I don't want to start arguing. I may say that if you don't have a goal where to go, you go nowhere.
Yeah, well, I think my goal is to struggle against the oppression. And, I think through that struggle, ideally, you create leverage. You create some space. And once that space is created, I think then we can start to really talk about the specifics of that goal. But right now, I would say the goal is to create that space. Yes?
So in the event that a one-state solution is implemented and everybody's granted free rights, it's pretty obvious to see that that Palestinians will be the majority, just from sheer demographics. Do you think that there will be some sort of, if that were to happen, there would be some sort of retaliatory backlash against what would become the minority, the Jewish people? And how would you, if that were to happen, how would we deal with that?
I think we use that prospect as a fear from even considering it. And I think what we need to do now is to start putting out some creative ideas for how these different peoples can live together, despite the fear. I remember that fear, the same things were said during South Africa. That they were convinced that once the majority of the blacks were given free rights, they were going to just create, bloodshed, and that never happened. I know that in studying the civil rights movement, that was a huge, and the slavery abolition, that was a huge, huge issue for slaveholders. That once slaves were set free, they were just going to go out and massacre, slaveholding whites, formerly slaveholding whites, left and right. And I think if we can use historical precedent, that hasn't been the case. What we have seen is actually the oppression sort of morphs into a different form too often. We lost slavery, but we got Jim Crow. We abolished Jim Crow during the civil rights movement, where we now have a mass incarceration system that persecutes people of color in some ways, according to some academics and scholars, in ways that were unprecedented, even during slavery times. So I think we need to think seriously about what will create a just peace. I think we need to get over the fear that keeps us from imagining what might be. And once we start to do that, I think the solutions begin to emerge. That's what's happened historically. There are some nascent examples of groups. There's an Israeli group called Zochrot, and other groups that are collaborating on just putting out some draft ideas of how maybe there could be regional autonomy in different parts of the land, and different forms of cultural autonomy, and different sort of maybe a republic approach. I mean, right now they're just exploratory, but I think that's the kind of creative thinking we need as opposed to one state will never happen, there'll be a bloodbath. We can't have it because Jews need a state. We can't have it because. I think we need to start creating the opening for more creative thinking on the issue. Oh, hands popping up everywhere. Yes.
So, first of all, thanks a lot for your speech. I wanted just to say something that people who live far away from Israel will only see what Israel represents its self-idea. But what about activists in social media who they don't try to make a hate speech. They only try to represent what's going on in real life because they have a relative, they have like a freedom to go there and they see what's going on real life. And lots of times, like social media blocked their accounts. They try to stop them from showing their own thoughts, and they just try to say, well, because we don't want it to have violation. But what kind of violation if you just represent what's going on the street? You didn't ask everyone. There's a big problem that people think that if you took what's going on in real life, you try to like let everyone hate Jewish. Just a moment. There's a big difference between being Jewish and being Israeli. It doesn't make any sense. Like you can like deal with anyone, just a human. But if you're holding a gun, it's going to be another issue.
Yeah, and that's something I didn't really understand until I met with Palestinians who told me that, you know, the only Jews they ever met until recently were soldiers with guns. And so they, you know, they use the word Jew because they're Jewish. You know, they don't use the word Israeli because there are non-Jewish Israelis. You know, to them that's their only image. And I think part of our creating the kind of space that I was talking about is really, right, showing people that there's lots of different kinds of people within any community.
And
you know?
like we live in a free country and we try to use free speech. But lots of times when it comes to Israel, they use the hate speech just to stop everyone to talk about what's going on.
Yeah, well, this country is sort of learning pretty quickly about that too. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering how, as like liberal Jews, we can pressure our like Jewish synagogues and organizations to portray more of like a real message or incorporate more about the occupation.
So I think, so the group I referred to you before, If Not Now, that's exactly their mission, which is to get the Jewish community, whether it's synagogues, Jewish federations, Jewish organizations, to start putting the issue of the occupation on their agenda. And that's there are chapters all over the country, and they do amazing, amazing work. So that's one very simple and straightforward way. I will say that it is, it's not easy work. And I say that as someone who was in a congregation for almost 20 years, and much of that doing this work. Israel is a very, very, it's a third rail issue. It often, Israel is more of a symbol for many Jews than a real country, and so there's a visceral response. So I think, like anything else, building trust through relationships. If you're in a synagogue and there are members of the synagogue or leaders in the synagogue or even the rabbi, or there are people that you can talk to honestly and openly about this issue and that they know it's important to you, to find some openings there, that's a way to do it. But that's sort of the old school, grassroots approach, which is just relationship by relationship. But I would say it's very, very difficult. And that's why outside the organized, established community, there are groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and others that are stepping up as alternatives, because we're just not welcome in the Jewish establishment world anymore. And I find that to be a very exciting thing, personally. So, yes.
Going back somewhat in history, but as I have understood that the Arabic Jewish community was encouraged heavily upon the development of the state, but for many a year were considered second-class citizens in Israel. If that's still true, is there a way in which they can be supported to bring something different from a perspective of Israeli Jews?
So the issue of Arab Jews is a really complex one, and I can give you a little bit of a thumbnail sort of sense of how it's evolved throughout history. That there have been Zionism is a European movement. It started in Europe. Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern and Western Europe, moving into the land. There were Palestinian Jews. There were Jews who lived, together with their Palestinian Muslim, Palestinian Christian neighbors. There were very significant Arab Jewish populations in Syria and Morocco and Iraq and Egypt and Yemen. And these, when they were brought to Israel and the new state of Israel, and again, it's a highly contested issue, and I can recommend readings, for you if you're interested. But by and large, what happened was, you're absolutely right, they were treated as second-class citizens by the largely white Ashkenazic Jewish establishment. What complicates things is that the white Ashkenazic Jewish establishment were largely socialist, left-leaning, labor Zionists who had control over the government, who had for decades, until 1977, when Menachem Begin and Likud came to power. And Likud depended on the vote of Mizrahim, so-called Eastern Arab Jews, because of their resentment and mistreatment at the hands of the Ashkenazic elite. You hear stories, and I have friends who talk about this, their parents who were, they were the elite in Damascus, in the Jewish community of Damascus. They were academics, they were lawyers, they were doctors, and they literally, when they came to Palestine, they were given like the worst shit jobs, on factory lines and et cetera. And and living in these border towns, that were often on the lines of either Gaza or Jordan. So that built a great deal of resentment among many in the Mizrahi community, and that was leveraged against the more left-leaning white elite of Israel. So today it's just gotten very complicated, because there has been some intermarriage, not a lot, but it's the remnants of that resentment, I think, still exist. It's also, I should mention that, even to complicate things further, in the early 70s there was a Israeli Black Panther Party of Arab Jews who were basically communists, who were protesting against the government and finding common cause with Palestinians. They were standing in solidarity with people who they considered to be their Arab brothers and sisters. So it's not as simple and straightforward as you might think at first glance, but there's lots of really interesting new scholarship about the Arab Jewish experience in Israel that's starting to shed light on the issue. Yes?
The question that actually, being in the colloquium, had come to mind about a week ago, and that is, are there ever any conversations or thought, in your experience or in conversations we've had in Israel or otherwise, with comparisons to the experiences of Liberia, being one of the few examples of a kind of returned people in population where there was actually a very tragic kind of moment, in the late 70s, early 80s, with respect to the relation of a American-Liberian elite and their kind of historical treatment of indigenous peoples, which in some ways parallels the more recent history of Israel. And is there ever any conversation or reckoning with that in Israel in comparison to a more analogous example?
Interesting. I'm sure there have been some studies that with the Liberia comparison. I'm not familiar with any, but as you're talking, I mean, it's a pattern, right? It's There's colonialism, there's sort of reverse colonialism. Whenever you move people from another place into a new place, there's going to be a reaction. There's going to be displacement, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be invariably bloodshed. And I think if you view the issue through a colonial lens or an anti-colonial lens, there's all kinds of comparisons that you can draw, whether it's indigenous people in this country, whether it's the African American community in this country who also experience state violence, and there's common cause that's actually been generated for some time now between many black activists and Palestinians, particularly the latest war in Gaza was in the fall of 2014, almost simultaneously with Ferguson. And there was a very lively social media back and forth between, not so much from Gaza because there wasn't, they didn't have that capability at the time, but there were Palestinians in the West Bank who were standing in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza who were actually tweeting and sending across social media how to make homemade remedies for tear gas, because it's the exact same tear gas that's used in the West Bank as is used in this country. It's actually made in this country in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, the connections are there, and they're being made all the time, both academically as well as from the point of view of activism and organizing. Yes?
I wanted to make a comment about the comment that the young man here made, which I thought was very interesting. What would happen if the moment of living side by side were to come in one state, and then the majority would be the Muslim people? Yes, but I think that the majority of the well-educated people and the people in positions of authority and so on would in fact still be
economic powers.
Which I think leads me at least to think in terms of the importance of educating the Muslim people. And the other is, because you also spoke about South Africa as a parallel sort of moment and something that tells us that we need not be afraid of such moments. But I think it is important to recognize that in South Africa they had very good leadership, and that was the person of Nelson Mandela, who was, very principled, who could have gotten out of prison for many times over the years and chose not to do so. And that's an unusual, nonviolent resistance type leadership that.
Yeah.
And you had good leadership on both sides, because
Yes.
there was de Klerk too.
Yeah, that's true.
So you have to have
That's
that
true.
will
Will
to succeed, and I think it would be there. I think there would be a will to succeed, would be my.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts about the issue of leadership. But before I do, the point I wanted to make with South Africa too, and one of the impediments to justice in South Africa is that the issue of economic equality was never really faced head on. And there's still a white elite, and there are still, I mean, they're not Bantustans, but they're still, look, not unlike in this country, quite honestly. And so the economic, I think Mandela was, that was a calculated move, that he knew that he would get the best deal that he could, and redistributing the wealth was just not, not in the cards. So, but I think the racial justice is, and the fact that we are seeing that in our lifetime is huge. I think, for those who lived through it, they understand. I mean, I remember talking to my parents, and they were saying they didn't see any other way out but a bloodbath, and then, the waters parted. I think it was due to leadership. I think sometimes we overestimate or over-idealize the power of leadership. I think also, governments do a good job of keeping leaders in prison. There are lots of potential Palestinian leaders who are in jail and who are not going to get out anytime soon the way Mandela did, if things continued the way they're going. But also I think when we focus too much on leadership, we underestimate the power of people, of the popular movements in the streets, because much of that leadership happens by people whose names we'll never know. People who are organizing on the ground, and I think that tips the scales in some ways as much as charismatic leaders.
At this point, I'd like to thank you all, members of the general public, for coming. Wonderful to see this